the question from @AlexPDX88. Why is everyone leaving Oregon women's basketball? As I promised, another 6-word question, Matt. So the trend at the back end of the show is they're short, but they sure are sweet.
Yes.
This one's this one's not particularly sweet because this was a tough one to sort of track last a couple days ago. In terms of the decision for Angela Dugalich to put her name in the transfer portal. Matt and I broke that story on Monday afternoon. This was just the 4th player Oregon has seen transfer out of the program since the conclusion of the season in the month of March. This one is probably the most painful because Dugalich, in theory, had 4 more years of eligibility. She was a 5-star recruit. And honestly, I think a player that Kelly Graves had said, numerous times that they thought her upside was really, really high. And this was not a player that they thought, oh, she's already kind of reached her ceiling. I think the sense had been, hey, the future's her best games and her best basketball is in the years to come, and that might've been as soon as this upcoming season. So that's the news that Alex is referring to. She joins Taylor Chavez and Jazz Shelley and Taylor Mikesell as players who've entered the portal. And again, why this one I think hurts a little more. The other 3 players had already played pretty far into their eligibility, and you kind of knew the limitations of what they could or could not become. And those were all put on display, I thought, last season. And for the most part, those 3 players, I think kind of you would say were a little underwhelming for the most part. And I don't think Dugalich fits into that. I thought she was pretty impressive when she played. Yeah. When she started, I think she started a couple of games and she played well in those games. And she had probably the team's best rebounder pound for pound. She averaged 4 rebounds a game in 13 minutes. I mean, that's pretty darn impressive. So there's the background there. More reporting on that I'll just share. I don't think this is this one's definitely not done. She's currently over in Serbia trying to earn a spot on the Serbian women's basketball national team. And she would play in the Olympics this summer if that does take place, assuming the Olympics do take place as well. So she's over there right now. She's trying to figure things out. She has not ruled out, and I got this from people close to her. I got this from people close to Oregon. She's not ruled out the possibility of returning to Oregon. So there's a possibility she does return, but still doesn't feel great. And, she might come back and it's going to feel a lot better, but she might not. And that puts Oregon in a tougher spot. And so, I think Oregon's going to have to hit that transfer portal a lot harder than we thought. I had Kelly Graves in a podcast not that long ago, and he was saying they weren't going to hit it at all. And now it's they're going to have to take a couple players.
That's the thing where it feels like he has no choice now, where he felt good about the roster and where it was at. But now that we've seen Jazz Shelley, now that we've seen Angela Dugalich, now that we've seen Mikesell transfer out, you've had you've had a roster that was intact, yeah. And now it's come to the case where whether you were hoping to do it and you chose not to, now you have to. Now you have to go out and find the player, probably 2, right? I almost think adding 1 transfer isn't going to be enough for the depth and the concerns that you might have with this team going forward. I look at this, and it's a weird deal too, because Eric, I still think their starting 5 is really good. And it's going to be probably a little difficult to go out there and find a grad transfer or a regular transfer that wants to come to Oregon that's viewed as a top 10 or top 15, top 5 type available transfer, because you don't really have any starter minutes available to offer, I don't think. I mean, Sabally and Prince are going to be your forwards, and then Scher and Parrish and Tahina Pau will probably be your starting guards. And it's going to be difficult, I think, to sell it of, hey, you're the 3rd best transfer available in the country. Come play, but we really can't guarantee you a starting spot. Not that Kelly Graves would, guarantee it, but it's sure, yeah. It's clearly obvious you're going to have to win a job. It's not more than likely you're going to be a starter.
Yeah, and a couple things on this one. I think it's worth noting Oregon had not landed anybody or added anybody. Partly that was because they had just lost a bunch of assistants and were kind of in the process of finalizing some things. They've since now finalized their staff, and we should note right before we found out about Angela entering the portal. Mike Moser, a former Oregon men's player, was announced as the third and final assistant coach for Kelly Graves' women's staff. They'd added Jackie Narrett Hairston about a week ago. She'd coached at Oregon in the past as a director of basketball ops kind of person, and had then moved on to Arizona, almost won a national championship with the Wildcats earlier in April. But so like they are now in the position where they can kind of put their foot down and kind of start working on this and try to build this roster and figure out what they need to address. And they now have the manpower and women power with both Narrett Hairston and Mike Moser, and then Jody Berry is the longtime assistant who stuck around when Mark Campbell took off to Sacramento State. So they now have the full complement of weapons to do that. And I think you're going to start, and I'll certainly have some updates in terms of some names to know on duckterritory.com this week or next week. And probably next time we're on a podcast, I can disclose some of those, and who knows, maybe something happens. But yeah, so that's, I do think they will add somebody. They're probably going to add a guard. They'll probably add a forward. I think they can use depth at both. And then just before we wrap this up with one last question, that's kind of a funny question. In terms of the why of why Angela's leaving, this was not the culture is broken thing as much as it's a thing of, hey, she didn't really have a lot of her friends and close people that were close to her, and big parts of why she came to Oregon that stuck around, because Campbell and Lopez and those two coaches were a big part in getting her to Eugene. And then her four closest friends, from what I heard from somebody who would know, all have either transferred or graduated. A couple of the girls that graduated had really taken her under her wing, as forwards, as big players, and had done that. And then a couple of guards were coming for a couple of her closest friends, and they just transferred. And now she's over in Serbia trying to sort this out. So that's kind of the why to this. I mean, I was even told she's aware that she might transfer somewhere and play less minutes at that new spot. That this is not like this was not playing time related. This was not culture related. This was like just straight up socially. It was a tough year. And Kelly Graves even mentioned on the podcast when he came on that, like, I asked him what was some of the surprising things people wouldn't know. Like Angela Dugalich said she hadn't even been to the other side of campus. Like there was a bunch of buildings she hadn't been on. She hadn't been outside of basically, the Oregon women's basketball little bubble of like, hey, these are the classrooms we go to. Here's the practice facility. Here's how we get to the airport to go to away games. Like she hadn't really done any exploring on her own because of COVID. So like socially, you can think of that from somebody who's from the state of Illinois, how that might be tough. So there's a lot at play there. I don't think it's quite ready to like, light your hair on fire and say the sky is falling, but this is certainly not the offseason you were hoping to have when you went out and competed hard down the stretch of the season and had pretty much everybody set to return. To lose 4, it kind of puts a tough, I think, taste in your mouth. And now it'll be the staff's job to go out and find some players to solidify this roster. And hopefully the big recruit is getting Angela back in the fold.
Real quick, I don't want to end the show here. Or I don't want to move on. I want to ask you a couple questions just about basketball from the women's standpoint. Because I don't know when we're going to talk about these assistant coaches that are being hired.
Yeah.
So let's take that opportunity. Your thoughts on Jamie Narrett Hairston and Mike Moser being hired? Like what were your first initial reactions, and just kind of how can they maybe help this program?
Yeah, Narrett Hairston made sense given the fact that I think you expected at least one of these hires to be somebody who'd worked for Coach Graves before. And you go look through his list of kind of his coaching tree, and there's a lot of people that made sense for that. But she was someone who was pretty easy to dial in on. She just had a lot of success recruiting to the Arizona Wildcats. In fact, you go and look at her success there. She'd helped recruit a couple of players that Oregon wanted in the 2021 and 2020 classes to Arizona, over Oregon. And so that she'd had some success on the trail. She brings that to Eugene. And then of course, like I said, that kind of experience with Kelly Graves, that part I think is significant. And again, having somebody who's coached in the conference, she's now coached at Oregon and Washington State and then at Arizona. She's done a little bit of a tour. She's been around this region. She knows, the schools in the conference. That one made, I think, a lot of sense. Moser is probably a little bit of I don't want to say it's a harder sell, but it's a less direct story, because it made sense for Narrett Hairston to come back. But right. Moser, it's like somebody who hasn't coached women's basketball, I don't think at all. He's not really been even an assistant coach. And the origin of this, and I know that there's been some other reporting on this, but Max Graves, one of Kelly Graves' sons, worked in the Dallas Mavericks front office and happened to be in the same department as Mike Moser. And those two kind of built a friendship from there. Obviously, the Oregon connection, and when these jobs opened up, it was kind of like, hey, this guy might actually be a good fit. And so it's pretty. I think that one's really kind of an interesting one, and I'm excited to kind of see how that plays out, because this is a little unusual to have a coach take this type of a job at Oregon, one of the premier coaching positions in the country for women's basketball, to bring in somebody who has literally zero coaching experience, especially from a women's perspective. Like, that's kind of a risk, but I know that there's a lot of optimism from what he can do. From a recruiting perspective, obviously he's going to have to kind of create his own network there, because he just doesn't have a lot of history doing it. But like, I think it's one you certainly are optimistic with. And hey, it's pretty cool, by the way, Matt, like, this guy was playing at Oregon the same time Joe Young was playing at Oregon. Like, he was not playing at Oregon very long ago, and now he's back in Eugene as an assistant coach for one of the programs. Like, it's just like kind of a cool story when it comes together like that.
I think his path to Oregon is probably a little unorthodox, kind of unusual, because like I said, he has no college experience, but I think his resume is certainly warranted. He's certainly qualified. I mean, he worked within the Dallas Mavericks organization, like you said, from an NBA standpoint. I mean, he was coaching and working at the highest level of this sport, man or women's. So I look at this and think, he's got the resume, if you will, to coach at this level. He just hasn't done this specific thing at the collegiate level. And, he's an up and coming guy, a younger guy. And I'm sure he will be kind of viewed as one of the players that, hey, like, because recruiting is a grind. Like you have to be able to just consistently recruit 365 days out of the year. And I think some of it naturally, falls on some of the younger players or younger coaches in the profession to kind of be on the staff. And that's not their only job, and that's not the only reason that they're there, but that's a big part of their responsibility. Is it's every day having to do something from a recruiting standpoint. And I think that's probably where, from an off the court area, he will help immensely, because he's got a lot of time. He's got that grind. He's got that drive to get into the profession and work his way up. And then on the field, super successful player as he is by himself. And then now has got the NBA resume as well. So I think it's a really cool story, and I'm excited to see kind of where he progresses. From a staff standpoint, they still have one position open, right?
Yeah, they got to get a director of basketball operations hired, and I'm imagining that's something that we'll hear sooner than later as well. That's like your fifth most important staff member on a basketball team. You got your head coach, your assistant coaches, and the director of basketball ops does a lot of the stuff behind the scenes that doesn't get maybe appreciated like it should, but does a lot of the kind of heavy lifting. So that was a job where you mentioned Xavi Lopez went to Sacramento State. His wife Megan Lopez had held that position for about half a decade, and she followed Campbell and her husband down there. So that's one more spot that's open. I'm sure that they'll announce something sooner than later. But that's the last part to finishing the staff. But fortunately, you get the assistants announced. They're the ones that do the recruiting, and that's really what Oregon really needs right now, is to go add a couple of players, I think, for their roster.